At the dawn of 3D in the gaming world, only two developers dared to attempt bringing the character action platformer into this new and uncharted third dimension. These two games were created independently of one another and with no knowledge of the other's progress or even its means of translating the genre. So it stands to reason that both of these games would have an overall vision that varied at least slightly, if not wildly. These two games were Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot. While Mario 64 was designed by the legendary Shigeru Miyamoto, who had received much acclaim and recognition already at this point in his career for being the father of the Donkey Kong, Mario, and Zelda series respectively. The second of these games, Crash Bandicoot, was developed by a small group of upstarts that had at this point only developed a few games, some well received, but others not so much. After taking an ultimately ill-fated stab at the fighting genre on the equally ill-fated 3DO, the developer Naughty Dog really wanted to try their hand at something different. And after analyzing the specs of all the forthcoming 3D consoles that were to come in this new hardware generation, the choice was clear to them that their next title should be developed for the PlayStation. While the idea did not come about with the explicit intent of creating a mascot to go toe-to-toe with Nintendo's own Mario, that is exactly what their forthcoming franchise ended up doing. In the many years since the release of those first three Crash Bandicoot games, talk of them and their merits have all but vanished, while Mario 64 remains very much at the forefront of conversation, both in regards to retro games and 3D platformers as a whole. The praise on Mario 64 is not undeserved by any means, but it is my opinion that the Crash Bandicoot series, specifically Crash 2, have been unjustly ignored and have an equal amount to offer in retrospect. I intend to make a case for exactly why that is in the most certain terms possible. A commonly used adage in the world of games is easy to learn, difficult to master. Crash Bandicoot exemplifies this adage better than most anything else I can think of. The game's most basic foundations, the control of the player character, is a wonderful exercise in restraint. Crash's verb set revolve around 4-directional movement, jumping, sliding, and a spin attack, with the added use of a sort of super jump, but this super jump is not required to finish any single level within the game. This stripped-down verb set gives the player a very minimal number of possible commands to learn, and thus allows them to spend the bulk of their time and effort on refining and perfecting their execution of these maneuvers. While this makes Crash a somewhat shallower game than Mario is from a control perspective, the upside is the level of immediacy that the more Spartan control method grants. By this I mean that there is a better chance of any random player being able to complete a given level within the game, not due to the game having easier platforming challenges, but due to the more easily understandable nature of both the controls and the movement. The best way to explain this is to think of each of these games' movesets like a language. The player uses this language to communicate with and navigate through the game. In that way, the language of Mario would be a more expressive language, with a larger vocabulary with which to describe very specific circumstances. Crash, by comparison, is a simpler, less expressive, but more efficient language. The player would be able to communicate with the game much faster, albeit in a less elegant way. This also reduces the amount of time a given player would need to spend looking up moves in the options menu if they forget them, which functions as a sort of dictionary in our incredibly long-winded analogy here. These differing movesets do not make one game inherently better than the other, but they are different and equally brilliant solutions to the same exact problem. This radical difference in approach does not stop at the controls, however. Crash Bandicoot takes the most direct and literal translation of 2D platformer level design and applies it to the 3D plane. Virtually every level in the main series uses a narrow, directed approach to level design. This allows for two things. The designer can know exactly where the player will be at certain points in the level. This is an important and necessary design conceit for that reason, and because it allowed the team to solve the most difficult problem facing them in the move into an uncharted dimension, and that is the camera system. This level design allowed for an on-rails camera system, meaning the camera follows a predetermined path based on the location of the player relative to the level. This is a brilliant solution for a number of reasons. For one, it allows the developer precise control over what the player sees and when. This means that the number of on-screen objects being rendered can be controlled to an exacting degree of precision. This allows for a more predictable and stable frame rate, and is the only reason that the incredibly expressive visuals in Crash Bandicoot were even possible. On top of this benefit, it allows the player to dedicate the entirety of their attention onto the locomotion of the character, rather than splitting their focus between both character and camera controls. This is the primary reason why 2D platformers are generally easier to control than 3D ones. This also differs from the solution chosen by the Mario team. They chose to give the player a camera that directly follows their movements and actions, controlled using the C buttons on the controller. This was done to allow full freedom of movement for the player, and also to allow a less linear flow of progression through the game's levels. This was necessary to keep the spirit of this new Mario game consistent with its predecessors, considering the number of secrets and general level of depth that had set Mario apart from his competitors for such a long time. The pros and cons of these differing approaches balance out to my mind, and the results are two 3D platformers with a completely unique style and feel. The differing cameras I mentioned previously gave each game a radically different art style, and by extension, a different approach to overall aesthetics and design focus. Crash's less dynamic camera allowed for a more focused field of view. The result gives the game's levels a relatively narrow path of play down which to travel, especially compared to the open spaces of Mario 64. While on the surface this may sound like a negative, let's examine this deeper. This more narrow focus allows a greater level of detail on screen at a time, and allows for the levels to feature uneven terrain, dense foliage, more complex obstacles, and more expressive enemies throughout the course of each level. By comparison, Mario 64 traffics mostly in flat plains. This, however, is not necessarily a negative either. More even planes of travel allow for a greater sense of freedom for the player, as well as a view distance and overall field of view that is much larger than what Crash's narrow focus allows. Again, these pros and cons balance out to me, and make both games a worthy and worthwhile pursuit. So at the end of the day, it comes down to this. Beyond the points I have already covered, both games are packed to the brim with content, peppered with interesting secrets, and feature a colorful cast of characters, enemies, and they both broke new ground in what was at the time a completely unexplored dimension, and moreover, both of them stand the test of time wonderfully. The difference between the two is that in our current day and age, one of these games is still talked about, while the other is largely ignored. Mario 64 deserves all of the praise that it gets, but hopefully I have made a convincing case as to why Crash really deserves some too. This is all I have to say for now, folks. Thanks for watching.